In 1897, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker sat down at his desk and gave a name to his vampire: Dracula. The book became the most famous horror novel ever written. The name became synonymous with the undead, with fangs and capes and castles in the mist. But Stoker didn't invent the name. He borrowed it. 400 years before the novel was published, the name Dracula belonged to a man, a prince of Wallachia, a kingdom wedged between the Ottoman Empire and the Christian West. His father had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, earning himself the title Dracula. The son inherited it. Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. The things he did made Stoker's fiction look tame. He impaled 20,000 people and left them standing in the sun. He attacked at midnight and vanished before dawn. When he died, they buried him in a monastery on an island, and when archaeologists opened the tomb 5 centuries later, it was empty. The real Dracula didn't need fangs. He had stakes, and the blood he spilled was real. On September 25, 1396, the largest Christian army assembled in a century rode south toward the Danube. French knights in gleaming plate armor led the van, their horses draped in silk caparisons embroidered with the fleur-de-lis. Behind them came Hungarian heavy cavalry, Burgundian nobles, German mercenaries, knights from England and Poland, and the Italian city-states, Wallachian auxiliaries who knew the terrain, and Hospitaller knights who had sailed from Rhodes. Contemporary chronicles estimated their strength at over 100,000 men. Modern historians suggest the true number was closer to 16,000, still the largest crusading force since the fall of Acre a century before. They had come for one purpose: to break the Ottoman advance into the Balkans and push the Sultan's armies back across the Bosporus. Pope Boniface IX had blessed the enterprise. The King of France had funded it. The King of Hungary, a young man named Sigismund of Luxembourg, had organized it. And every knight in that column believed God was on their side. They called it a crusade, the last great crusade of medieval Europe. And on the fields outside a fortress called Nicopolis, it would end in a single afternoon. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I had studied the Crusaders. Men called him the Thunderbolt for the speed of his campaigns. He had conquered more territory in 10 years than his father had in 30. He understood European warfare. He understood European pride, and he understood exactly how to use that pride against them. The French knights were the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, and they knew it. When the battle began, they demanded the honor of the first charge. Sigismund argued against it. He knew the terrain. He knew that Bayezid had infantry screens designed to absorb exactly this kind of frontal assault. But the French would not be denied their glory. They charged. They broke through the Ottoman front lines, and then they crested the hill and saw what Bayezid had hidden behind it. 10,000 fresh Sipahi cavalry, mounted archers, and the elite Janissary Corps, troops that had not yet fought. The Crusaders were exhausted. Their horses were blown, and they were surrounded. The slaughter lasted hours. The French commander, Jean de Nevers, was captured. The Count of Eu was captured. Sigismund's own brother-in-law was captured. When the killing stopped, Bayezid ordered mass executions. Thousands of prisoners were killed where they knelt. Those of high enough birth to be valuable were ransomed back to their families for sums that bankrupted noble houses across Europe. The ransom for Jean de Nevers alone was 200,000 gold florins, enough to build a cathedral. Among those who escaped the carnage was Sigismund himself. He fled down the Danube by fishing boat, traveling through the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a journey of months before he finally reached his own kingdom again. His armor was dented, his army was annihilated, His reputation as a military leader was destroyed. He had staked everything on this crusade: his treasury, his political capital, his claim to leadership of Christian Europe, and he had lost. For 12 years, Sigismund rebuilt. He secured his throne against rivals who smelled weakness. He consolidated his alliances. He watched the Ottomans continue their advance, taking more of the Balkans, pressing ever closer to the heart of Europe. And he planned. On December 12, 1408, in the city of Oradia, Sigismund created something new. He called together 24 of the most powerful lords in his realm: Hungarian barons, Serbian despots, Transylvanian voivodes, and bound them together in a secret order. A brotherhood of Christian knights sworn to a single purpose: to defend the faith against its enemies, to protect Sigismund's dynasty, and to ensure that Nicopolis would never happen again. He named it the Societas Draconistrarum, the Society of the Dragonists. In common speech, the Order of the Dragon. Its members would wear a symbol, an Ouroboros, a dragon curved in a circle with its tail wrapped around its own neck, swallowing itself. The Signum Draconis, the sign of the dragon. It represented the enemy to be defeated. It represented the eternal vigilance required to defeat him, and it would give a name to a dynasty that would haunt Europe for generations. In 1431, a Wallachian warlord named Vlad arrived at Sigismund's court in Nuremberg. Sigismund was Holy Roman Emperor now, the most powerful Christian monarch in Europe. Vlad was a claimant to a minor throne, Wallachia, a principality south of Transylvania, wedged between the Kingdom of Hungary and the expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a buffer state, a place that existed only because larger powers found it useful as a barrier. Vlad had come to pledge his loyalty. In exchange, Sigismund would support his claim to the Wallachian throne against his rivals. The emperor inducted Vlad into the Order of the Dragon. He placed the pendant around Vlad's neck, the same Ouroboros symbol that Sigismund had worn since he founded the order in the aftermath of Nicopolis, 23 years before. The same symbol that marked a man as a defender of Christendom against the Ottoman threat. The same symbol that would pass from father to son. From that day forward, Vlad was known by a new name: Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. He would wear the pendant for the rest of his life. He would mint coins bearing the dragon symbol. He would build his entire political identity around the order and what it represented. But in Romanian, the word carries a second meaning. Dracul means dragon. Dracul also means devil. The peasants who saw Vlad Dracul ride past, the dragon pendant glinting at his throat, did not always know which word they meant. That same year, 1431, Vlad Dracul's wife gave birth to a son. The boy was born in Sighișoara, a fortified town in Transylvania where Vlad was stationed as a military commander. They named him Vlad after his father, but the people would call him by a different name. The town of Sighișoara sits on a hill in the heart of Transylvania. In 1431, it was a Saxon citadel, a fortified German-speaking colony planted by the Kingdom of Hungary to guard the Carpathian passes. The walls had stood for 3 centuries. 14 towers ringed the perimeter, each maintained by a different guild: the Tailor's Tower, the Furrier's Tower, the Tinsmith's Tower. At the center rose the Clock Tower, 64 meters tall, its mechanical clock marking the hours for merchants and soldiers and priests. The streets inside the walls were narrow and cobbled, crowded with timber-framed houses, painted in fading yellows and blues and reds. The air smelled of wood smoke and tanneries and the livestock markets in the lower town. German was spoken in the guild halls. Latin was spoken in the churches. And in a house on Tin Street, A Wallachian noble and his wife were expecting their second son. The house still stands today. It sits at Tin Street No. 1. In the 15th century, it belonged to Vlad Dracula, the man who had just received the dragon pendant from Emperor Sigismund. His wife, possibly a daughter of the Prince of Moldavia, though the records are unclear, gave birth in that house sometime in late 1431. The child would have spent his first years within those walls, within that citadel. He would have heard the clock tower mark the hours. He would have watched the guild processions on feast days, the furriers and tailors and blacksmiths marching with their banners. He would have learned his first words in a household where power was measured in swords and alliances and the favor of distant kings. His father wore the dragon, the badge Vlad would inherit, along with the name. In 1436, when the boy was 4 or 5 years old, his father finally seized the throne of Wallachia. The family left Sighishuara and moved south, into the principality that Vlad Dracula had spent years fighting to claim. The boy would never return to the house where he was born, but he would carry its legacy, the dragon, the name, the violence that came with both, for the rest of his life. By 1442, Vlad Dracula had spent 6 years trying to survive between two empires. To the northwest lay the Kingdom of Hungary, the Christian power that had installed him on the Wallachian throne and expected his loyalty in return. The Hungarians controlled Transylvania, where Vlad had once governed fortresses and where his son had been born. They expected him to guard the mountain passes against Ottoman incursion. To the southeast lay the Ottoman Sultanate, the Islamic Empire that had conquered the Balkans, crushed the crusade at Nicopolis, and now cast its shadow over every principality between Constantinople and Vienna. Wallachia sat between them, a buffer zone, a prize, a trap. Vlad Dracula had joined the Order of the Dragon. He had sworn to fight the Ottomans, but oaths were luxuries for kings with armies, and Vlad Dracula had neither. His principality was poor, his treasury empty, his boyar lords more interested in their own estates than in crusading ventures. After Sigismund's death in 1437, Hungary entered a succession crisis. The support Vlad had counted on evaporated. In 1438, desperate, he made a different choice. He paid homage to Sultan Murad II and joined an Ottoman raid into Transylvania, the same Transylvania where his son had been born, the same territory he was sworn to defend as a Knight of the Dragon. He burned villages, he took prisoners, he proved his loyalty to the crescent instead of the cross. By 1441, the political winds shifted again. A Hungarian warlord named John Hunyadi was carving through Ottoman forces in Transylvania, winning victory after victory. He urged Vlad to join a new crusade against the Sultan. Vlad hesitated. He had already betrayed the Ottomans once by swearing to the dragon. He had betrayed the Hungarians by raiding with the Turks. Now, both sides watched him, waiting for him to choose. In March 1442, Hunyadi won a crushing victory over an Ottoman army in Transylvania. The Sultan noticed that Vlad Dracula had not lifted a finger to help. Murad II sent a summons to the Wallachian prince. "Come to Edirne, explain yourself, and bring your sons." Vlad Dracula rode to Edirne with a small retinue. He brought his 2 youngest sons with him, Vlad, age 11, and Radu, age 7. His eldest son, Mircea, he left behind in Wallachia. Perhaps Vlad thought their presence would demonstrate good faith, a sign that he had nothing to hide, that his family trusted the Sultan's hospitality. Perhaps he had no choice. The summons may have specifically demanded the boys. The historical record does not say what he told the boys as they rode east across the Danube and into Ottoman territory. It does not say whether they understood where they were going or why. The journey took weeks. They crossed river valleys and mountain passes, traveling roads where Ottoman soldiers collected tolls, and Ottoman administrators kept records of every caravan that passed. The deeper they traveled into the Sultan's territory, the more the landscape changed. Bulgarian churches converted to mosques, Greek-speaking merchants replaced by Turkish traders, the crescent flag flying over every fortress and watchtower. By the time they reached Edirne, they had entered another world. Edirne was the Ottoman capital, a city of minarets and palaces, of markets that sold silk and spices from Persia and India, of administrative buildings where the affairs of an empire were managed with ruthless efficiency. The population was larger than any city Vlad had ever seen. The wealth was staggering: fountains in public squares, domed mosques covered in painted tiles, gardens where tulips bloomed in geometric precision. When Vlad Dracula arrived at the Sultan's court, he was escorted through courtyards designed to impress and intimidate. The meeting that followed did not go well. Murad II accused Vlad of treachery. He pointed to Vlad's membership in the Order of the Dragon, an organization explicitly founded to destroy the Ottoman Empire. He pointed to Vlad's failure to send troops when the Ottoman army marched into Transylvania. The Sultan had a simple question: whose side was Vlad Dracula on? Vlad had no good answer. He was arrested on the spot. The terms of Vlad's release were brutal. He would pay an annual tribute to the Sultan, 10,000 gold ducats, a sum that would drain his treasury. He would send 500 Wallachian boys each year to be conscripted into the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite infantry, drawn from Christian children converted to Islam and trained to die for the empire. And he would leave his 2 youngest sons behind as hostages. Vlad Dracula accepted. He had no choice. The alternative was execution and the installation of a more compliant puppet on the Wallachian throne. At least this way, he could return to his kingdom. At least this way, he could hope his sons might someday come home. Before the end of 1442, Vlad rode back to Wallachia alone. His sons remained in Ottoman custody. Vlad, age 11, and Radu, age 7, were escorted to the fortress of Erigöz in Anatolia, hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by strangers who spoke a language they did not understand, hostages for a father they would not see again for years. The boys were not prisoners in the usual sense. They were investments. The Ottomans had learned that the best way to control a hostile principality was to raise its future rulers themselves, train them in Ottoman customs, teach them Turkish and Arabic, indoctrinate them in the ways of the court. Then, when the current ruler died or became inconvenient, install the hostage prince on the throne with Ottoman backing. He would be grateful. He would be loyal. He would be theirs. Radu would become exactly what they hoped. Vlad would become something else entirely. For 6 years, the 2 Wallachian princes lived within the system their father's surrender had bought them. The Ottomans called it education. It was closer to indoctrination. Another hostage prince, an Albanian named Gjergj Kastrioti, had been raised in this same palace school a generation earlier. The Ottomans trained him, converted him, gave him a new name, Skanderbeg, and trusted him with an army. He defected the moment he had the chance, returned to Albania, and spent the rest of his life fighting his former masters. The Ottomans remembered that failure. They watched their hostages more carefully now. Vlad and Radu were enrolled in the same schools that trained the sons of Ottoman nobility. They learned Turkish and Arabic. They studied calligraphy, mathematics, logic, and the Quran. They were taught horsemanship by cavalrymen who had conquered half of Europe. They learned archery and swordsmanship from soldiers who had faced Crusader knights at Nicopolis and won. The education was excellent. The surveillance was constant. Every servant might be a spy. Every friendship might be a test. Every letter from home was read before it reached them, if it reached them at all. The two brothers responded to captivity in opposite ways. Radu had been young enough to adapt, young enough to forget. He learned Turkish easily. He made friends among the Ottoman princes. He was beautiful, with delicate features and dark curling hair, and the Ottomans valued beauty. By the time he was 10, Radu had caught the attention of a young prince named Mehmed, the Sultan's son, heir to the throne. The two became close. How close? The historical sources do not agree. But Radu found a place in the Ottoman court. He converted to Islam. He became a favorite. He forgot his Romanian. He forgot his father's faith. He stopped speaking to his brother about home. Vlad was 11, had been old enough to remember everything. Old enough to remember his father kneeling before the Sultan. Old enough to remember the terms, the tribute, the Janissary boys, the humiliation. He learned Turkish because he had to. He learned Ottoman customs because refusing meant punishment. But he never adapted. He never made friends. He was sullen, defiant, insubordinate. The court records note that he was disciplined repeatedly for his behavior. Beatings, confinement, reduced rations. When other hostage princes learned to bow correctly, Vlad bowed wrong on purpose. When instructors demanded respect, Vlad gave silence. When guards tried to force him to pray in the Ottoman fashion, he spat. In 1444, news reached the hostages. Their father had joined a new crusade against the Ottomans. Vlad Dracula had sent troops to support the Christian coalition at the Battle of Varna. The crusade failed. The Hungarian-Polish king died on the battlefield. The Christian army was annihilated. But Vlad Dracula had shown his true loyalties. The Sultan was furious. Vlad and Radu's lives hung by a thread. Only the need to keep leverage over Wallachia saved them. The Ottomans had broken princes before. They expected to break this one too. But every punishment they gave Vlad only hardened him further. They were creating the very thing they feared. What Vlad witnessed in those 6 years would shape everything that came after. The Ottoman Empire ruled through power, but it also ruled through terror. Executions were public, punishments were theatrical, and one method of execution was used above all others to send a message: impalement. The Ottomans did not invent it. The Assyrians had used it. The Persians had used it. The Romans had used it. They called it crucifixion. But the Ottomans perfected it as a tool of psychological warfare. Traitors, rebels, criminals, all were displayed on stakes in public squares, their bodies visible for days, a warning to anyone who might consider defiance. Vlad was made to watch. The historical sources are clear on this. Hostage princes were deliberately shown what happened to those who challenged Ottoman authority. It was part of the education. Learn your lessons, obey your masters, or end up on a stake. Most hostage princes learned the intended lesson. They came away afraid, compliant, grateful for the Sultan's mercy. Vlad learned something different. He did not learn to fear impalement. He learned how it was done. He studied the method, the positioning of the stake, the angle, the way bodies were arranged for maximum visibility. He memorized the logistics, how many soldiers it took, how long the victims survived, how far the screams carried. The Ottomans meant to teach him obedience. Instead, they gave him a weapon. Something died in that boy during those 6 years in Ottoman captivity. Something else was born. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia, he would bring the lessons of the Ottoman court with him. He would show his enemies what he had learned, and he would surpass his teachers. In late November 1447, John Hunyadi crossed the Carpathian Mountains with an army. The same John Hunyadi who had urged Vlad Dracula to join the crusade against the Ottomans 5 years earlier. the same John Hunyadi, whose victory had forced Vlad to submit to the Sultan's summons. Now Hunyadi was coming to finish what he had started. The political situation had become untenable. Vlad Dracul had spent years trying to balance between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and he had satisfied neither. When Hunyadi called for crusade, Vlad sent a token force, enough to anger the Sultan, not enough to satisfy the Christians. When the crusade failed at Varna in 1444, Hunyadi blamed Vlad for the defeat. When Vlad made peace with the Ottomans to protect his sons, Hunyadi called him a traitor to Christendom. Hunyadi was the most powerful military commander in Eastern Europe. He had spent 2 decades fighting the Ottomans. He had broken their armies at Transylvania. He had defended Belgrade. And he had decided that Vlad Dracul was more useful dead than alive. Hunyadi brought a claimant with him, Vladislav II, a cousin of Vlad Dracul from a rival branch of the family. The message was clear. Wallachia would have a new prince, one who would do what Hunyadi commanded, one who would not play games with the Sultan. Vlad Dracul fled Targoviste before Hunyadi arrived. He knew he could not hold the capital against a Hungarian army. He gathered what loyal men he could find and rode south, hoping to reach Ottoman territory where the Sultan might offer protection. But Hunyadi had planned for this. Hungarian cavalry cut off the southern roads. Vlad was forced into the marshes, the wetlands near a village called Baltani, where the ground was soft and horses moved slowly. They caught him in the fog. The details of Vlad Dracul's death are sparse in the historical record. We know he was killed in late November or early December 1447. We know he died in the marshes of Baltani. We know his body was left where it fell. No state funeral, no tomb, no monument. The man who had worn the dragon pendant for 16 years ended his life in the mud. The Order of the Dragon had been founded to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. Vlad Dracul had been inducted into the order by the emperor himself, and he died at the hands of Christians, killed by the same Hungarian faction that the order was supposed to serve. Mircea's death was worse. Vlad's eldest son had been left behind in Wallachia when his father fled. He was captured by the Saxon elite of Targoviste, the German merchant class that controlled much of the city's economy and resented Vlad Dracul's policies. They had allied with Hunyadi. They had scores to settle. The historical sources describe what happened next in clinical terms. Mircea was blinded with a hot iron poker. Then he was buried alive. The merchants and boyars who did this left his body in an unmarked grave somewhere near Targoviste. He was in his late teens, perhaps 20 years old. He had been co-ruler of Wallachia alongside his father. He had expected to inherit the throne. Instead, he died screaming in the dark. The last thing he ever saw, the red glow of the iron coming toward his eyes. Mircea's death was not just murder, it was a message. The boyars and Saxons who killed him wanted Hunyadi to know they were committed. They wanted to prove their loyalty to the new regime, and they wanted to ensure that Vlad Dracul's bloodline would have no easy path back to power. They did not know that 2 of Vlad's sons were still alive, hostages in the Ottoman court, hundreds of miles away. They did not know that one of those sons would remember. The news reached Vlad in the Ottoman court sometime in early 1448. His father was dead. His elder brother was dead. The throne of Wallachia belonged to a usurper backed by the same Hungarian lords who had inducted Vlad Dracul into the Order of the Dragon. The dragon pendant, the symbol his father had worn for 16 years, the symbol that gave Vlad his name, was gone, lost in a marsh or taken as a trophy by the men who killed him. Vlad was 17 years old. He had been a hostage for 6 years. He had watched his brother Radu forget their family, forget their faith, forget everything except how to please the Ottoman court. He had witnessed executions. He had endured punishments. He had learned to hide everything behind a stone face. Now there was nothing left to hide. His father was dead. Mircea was dead. His mother's fate was unknown. The boyars who had served his family for generations had betrayed them. The Saxons who had lived in Targovista under Dracula's protection had blinded and buried his brother. John Hunyadi, the great Christian crusader, the champion of the faith, had ordered it all. Vlad made a vow. We do not know the words. We do not know if he spoke them aloud or only in his heart. But everything that happened afterwards suggests what that vow contained. He would return to Wallachia. He would take back his father's throne, and he would make every boyar, every Saxon, every traitor who had a hand in his family's murder pay for what they had done. The Ottomans, watching their hostage, saw an opportunity. An angry prince with a claim to a Christian throne was a useful tool. They would give Vlad an army. They would send him home, and they would see what he did with the lessons they had taught him. In October 1448, the Ottomans gave Vlad an army. It was not a large army, perhaps 500 cavalry, enough to take an undefended throne. The Ottomans had done this before. They maintained a collection of displaced princes, exiled claimants, and ambitious younger sons, hostages who could be deployed as puppets whenever a border state needed regime change. Vlad was one such piece on the board. The Sultan did not care whether Vlad succeeded in the long term. He cared that Wallachia remained destabilized, unable to unite against Ottoman interests. The timing was perfect. John Hunyadi had marched north with the combined forces of Hungary and Wallachia to fight the Ottomans at Kosovo. Vladislav II, the man who had replaced Vlad's father, the man who sat on the Wallachian throne thanks to Hunyadi's invasion, had gone with him. The capital was empty. The boyars were nervous, and a 17-year-old prince with Ottoman backing was crossing the Danube. Vlad rode into Targovista in late October. The boyars who had murdered his father and brother barely a year earlier watched from their estates as the son of Vlad Dracula claimed the throne. Some fled immediately, fearing retribution. Some made hasty declarations of loyalty, hoping to survive another transition. None trusted him. He did not trust them either. He knew their names. He noted their faces. He stored this information for later. For approximately 2 months, Vlad III was voivode of Wallachia. He was young, untested, ruling with Ottoman soldiers at his back. The historical records from this first reign are sparse. We do not know what policies he pursued, what decrees he issued, what plans he made. We know only that he sat in his father's chair, wore his father's title, and waited for news from Kosovo. We know that the boyars watched him as carefully as he watched them. And we know that somewhere in those 2 months, he began to understand what kind of voivode he would need to become. The news from Kosovo was bad. The Christian coalition had been crushed. Hunyadi's army had broken against the Ottoman defenses. The Hungarian regent himself had barely escaped with his life, fleeing through Serbian territory, disguised as a peasant. The Ottomans had won. Their candidate for the Wallachian throne, Vlad, should have been strengthened by the news. But war produced unexpected alliances. Hunyadi was returning to Hungary, and he would pass through Wallachia. Vladislav II was with him. The same boyars who had smiled at Vlad when Hunyadi was far away would open the gates the moment his army appeared on the horizon. The Ottomans had given Vlad a throne, but they had not given him the power to hold it. In December 1448, Vlad fled. He abandoned Targoviste before Hunyadi arrived, slipping south toward Ottoman territory. His first reign had lasted approximately 2 months. He had learned something important. The throne of Wallachia could be taken with a small army at the right moment, but keeping it required something else, something he did not yet have. 8 years would pass before he got another chance. For 8 years, Vlad wandered. After his flight from Wallachia in December 1448, he found shelter in Moldavia, a neighboring principality ruled by Bogdan II, who was either his uncle or a kinsman through his mother's line. Bogdan had his own reasons to distrust the Hungarians, and he welcomed a displaced Wallachian prince with a claim to a throne. Vlad spent 3 years in the Moldavian court. He was no longer a hostage. He was a guest without power, without an army, without prospects, but a guest nonetheless. He made a friend there, Bogdan's son Stephen, a boy close to his own age who would later become Stephen the Great, one of the most celebrated rulers in Romanian history. The two young exiles formed a bond that would last decades. They trained together, they hunted together, they discussed statecraft and warfare and the cold realities of Balkan politics. When Stephen eventually took his own throne, he would remember the Wallachian prince who had shared his exile. In October 1451, Bogdan II was assassinated. A rival claimant named Peter III. Aaron drove a sword through him and seized the Moldavian throne. Vlad and Stephen fled together, crossing into Transylvania, into territory controlled by the same John Hunyadi who had killed Vlad's father. It was a desperate move. Vlad had nowhere else to go. The Ottomans, his former sponsors, had little use for a prince who had already lost his throne and failed to hold it. The only path forward led through the man who had destroyed his family. Hunyadi, for his part, saw an opportunity. He was a practical man, a soldier above all else. He did not waste useful tools. Vlad spoke fluent Turkish. He understood Ottoman military tactics, the composition of their armies, the speed of their cavalry, the way their commanders thought. He knew Ottoman court politics, the factions and rivalries, the way the Sultan's mind worked. He hated the Ottomans with a cold fury that Hunyadi could use. So instead of killing the son as he had killed the father, Hunyadi made Vlad an advisor. He assigned him to defend the Transylvanian border against Ottoman raids. He tested him, he watched him, and he waited. By 1456, Hunyadi had concluded that Vladislav II, the man he had installed on the Wallachian throne 8 years earlier, was no longer reliable. The usurper was making deals with the Ottomans. He was failing to support Hungarian military campaigns. He had become the same problem Vlad Dracula had been. Hunyadi needed a new puppet, and Vlad was ready. In August 1456, Vlad crossed the Carpathians with a Hungarian army at his back. The timing was not coincidental. John Hunyadi had just achieved the greatest victory of his career, the defense of Belgrade against an Ottoman siege led by Sultan Mehmed II himself. Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, had brought 200,000 men to capture the Hungarian fortress. Hunyadi had driven them back. The Ottomans retreated in disarray. Christian Europe celebrated. And then, a week later, Hunyadi died, killed by plague that swept through his camp after the battle. The invasion of Wallachia had already been decided before Hunyadi's death. The old warlord had concluded that Vladislav II was unreliable. The usurper had failed to send troops to Belgrade. He had been making overtures to the Ottomans. He was becoming the same problem that Vlad Dracula had been. Hunyadi's solution was the same. Replace the voivode with someone more tractable. This time, that someone was the man whose father Hunyadi had killed. Matthias Corvinus, Hunyadi's son, inherited his father's position and his father's plans. The young regent needed a reliable ally controlling the mountain passes between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Vlad had spent 8 years proving his worth. defending the Transylvanian border, fighting in Hungarian campaigns, providing intelligence on Ottoman tactics that only someone raised in the Sultan's court could possess. Now, he was cashing in those debts. Vladislav II saw the army coming. The usurper, who had sat on Vlad's father's throne for 9 years, knew what was approaching. He knew the dragon banner. He knew the face beneath the Hungarian helmet. He gathered what forces he could muster, the same boyars who had betrayed Vlad Dracula a decade earlier and rode out to meet the invasion. The two armies met near Targovista. The details of the battle are not well documented. We know it was brief. We know Vladislav's forces broke quickly, and we know that Vladislav II himself was killed, probably by Vlad personally, though the sources disagree on the exact circumstances. Some say it was single combat. Some say Vlad found him fleeing. It does not matter. The usurper was dead. The throne was empty. Vlad entered Targovista as voivode of Wallachia. He was 25 years old. He had waited 8 years for this moment. He had watched his father and brother die at the hands of boyars who sat in the council chambers of this very palace. He had spent 6 years as an Ottoman hostage, learning terror. He had spent 8 years as an exile, learning patience. Now he had learned everything he needed. The boyars who had survived the battle presented themselves at court. They smiled. They bowed. They swore their loyalty to the new voivode, just as they had sworn loyalty to Vladislav II, just as they had sworn loyalty to Vlad Dracula before that. They expected business as usual. A new prince meant new bribes, new alliances, new opportunities. They did not understand what they were dealing with. Vlad studied their faces. He remembered their names. Some of them had been in the room when his brother was blinded. Some of them had opened the gates for Hunyadi. All of them had prospered while his family died. He accepted their oaths. He smiled back, and he began to plan. On Easter Sunday, Vlad invited the boyars of Wallachia to a feast. The date varies depending on the source. Some say 1457, others 1459, but the event is consistent in every account. The nobility of Wallachia gathered at the royal palace in Targovist to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. They came in their finest clothes. The great boyars arrived first, the lords who held vast estates and occupied the highest offices of state. The spatar, who carried the ceremonial sword. The logofat, the chancellor who managed royal correspondence. The vistier, who controlled the treasury. The vornik, who administered the court. These were the men who formed the princely council that advised the voivode on all matters of governance. In theory, they served at the pleasure of the prince. In practice, they had outlived dozens of princes. Their power came from land, from wealth, from networks of kinship and obligation that stretched across generations. No voivode ruled Wallachia without their cooperation, and no voivode survived long if he lost their support. Tables were laid with meat and wine. The great hall filled with the most powerful families in the principality, the landowners, the councillors, the kingmakers. The same boyars who had served Vlad Dracula, the same boyars who had opened the gates for Hunyadi, the same boyars who had stood by while Mircea was blinded and buried alive. Vlad sat at the head of the hall. He watched them eat his food and drink his wine. He listened to their laughter. Then he asked them a question. How many princes had they served? How many voivodes had sat on this throne during their lifetimes? The boyars, uneasy now, sensing something wrong, answered carefully. Some had served under 7 princes, some under 10, some under more. The throne of Wallachia had changed hands constantly during their lives, and they had survived each transition by switching allegiances at the right moment. That was the problem, Vlad said. That was why Wallachia was weak. That was why his father was dead. The guards moved. The doors were barred. The boyars who reached for their weapons found them gone, collected at the entrance as was customary at formal events. They were trapped in a hall with a man who had spent 6 years learning violence from the Ottomans and 8 years waiting to use it. The old boyars, the lords who had served too many princes, the men whose loyalty was for sale, were taken outside. The historical sources describe what happened next in a single word: impalement. Vlad used the method he had learned in Ottoman captivity. He used it on the men who had betrayed his father. Stakes were erected in the courtyard while the feast tables were still being cleared. The screaming would have been audible inside the palace. The survivors were not released. They were marched. Approximately 200 boyars, the younger ones, those Vlad considered still useful as laborers, were forced out of Targovist on foot, still wearing their Easter feast clothes. Their wives went with them. Their children went with them. Guards on horseback flanked the column, ensuring no one escaped. They were marched approximately 50 miles north into the Carpathian foothills, to the ruins of an ancient fortress called Poenari. The walk alone killed some of them. The nobles of Wallachia had never done physical labor in their lives. They were soft, accustomed to servants, unused to walking 50 miles on mountain roads. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed. Some collapsed and were left where they fell. Those who survived the march discovered what awaited them: a ruined castle on a cliff edge, overlooking a gorge cut by the Argies River. The original structure dated back 2 centuries, a rectangular tower, roughly 28 feet on each side, 4 stories tall, built by an earlier voivode. Vlad intended to transform it into the most defensible fortress in Wallachia. The boyars became builders. They quarried rough stone from the mountainside. They hauled it up paths too steep for carts. They mixed mortar using Byzantine techniques, outer walls of cut stone, cores of rubble and earth, reinforced with wooden beams. The walls grew to 10 feet thick. Vlad added a 200-foot curtain wall. He added 3 semicircular towers with firing positions for archers. He created a fortress that could hold against any siege, built by the hands of men whose ancestors had never lifted anything heavier than a wine goblet. They worked until their expensive clothes rotted off their backs. They worked until their soft hands became calloused and broken. They worked until many of them died from exhaustion and exposure. The chronicles of the time record no mercy, no rest, no release. Vlad wanted 2 things from Poenari. First, a fortress. The castle sat on a crag nearly 1,500 feet above the river, a position so impregnable that it could only be reached by climbing. Vlad would use it as a personal refuge in the years to come. Second, a message. The boyars who had spent generations trading loyalty for power would spend the rest of their lives in hard labor. Their class was broken. Their wealth meant nothing. Vlad would rule Wallachia without them. Why did Vlad do it? The German propaganda pamphlets, printed decades later by merchants who hated him, would claim he was simply mad, a bloodthirsty tyrant who killed for pleasure. The vampire legends would build on this, portraying him as an inhuman monster. The truth was more calculated. Vlad had spent his life watching Wallachian politics. He had watched his father try to navigate between empires, only to be betrayed by his own lords. He had watched his brother buried alive by men who claimed to serve the voivode. He had watched 7, 8, 10 princes rise and fall, while the same boyar families prospered regardless of who sat on the throne. The boyars were the problem. As long as they controlled the land, the wealth, the military forces of the principality, no voivode could rule securely. They would always be ready to switch sides. They would always be ready to open the gates. Vlad solved the problem the only way he knew how. He killed the disloyal. He destroyed their power. He replaced them with men who owed their positions entirely to him: minor nobles, soldiers, administrators who had no independent base of support. Terror was not madness. terror was policy, and it worked. For 6 years, Vlad III would rule Wallachia without serious internal opposition. The boyars who remained were too afraid to move against him. The new men he appointed were too dependent on his favor. The throne was secure for the first time in a generation. The man they would call the Impaler had made his point. The Saxons of Transylvania had been a problem for Wallachia for generations. They were German settlers, colonists who had arrived in the 12th century, brought by Hungarian kings to develop the frontier. They built fortified cities: Brasov, Sibiu, Bystritha. They controlled the mountain passes. They dominated trade between the Ottoman East and the Christian West. And they answered to the Hungarian crown, not to any Wallachian voivode. For Vlad, the Saxons represented multiple threats. Economically, they strangled Wallachian commerce. Saxon merchants had historically traded tax-free in Wallachia, buying goods at prices they set themselves, then selling those goods in Central European markets for enormous profits. Wallachian merchants who tried to trade directly in Saxon cities were excluded, harassed, sometimes killed. The Saxons had even confiscated goods from Wallachian traders. Steel purchased legally in Brasov had been seized and the merchants expelled. This was not a minor grievance. This was economic subjugation. Politically, the Saxons sheltered Vlad's enemies. When rival claimants to the Wallachian throne needed a safe haven, they fled to Brasov or Sibiu. When boyars wanted to plot against their voivode, they met with Saxon merchants who promised Hungarian backing. The Saxons had supported Vladislav II. They had supported Dan III. They would support anyone who kept Wallachia weak and divided. Vlad understood this calculus. He also understood that the Saxons were technically subjects of the Hungarian king, and Hungary was, in theory, his ally. Direct confrontation risked his relationship with Matthias Corvinus. Indirect pressure might work better. He began by imposing trade restrictions. Wallachian merchants would no longer travel to Saxon cities. Saxon merchants who entered Wallachia would sell only at designated market towns: Targsor, Kampelung, Targovista, under Wallachian control and subject to Wallachian taxation. No more tax-free trading. No more setting prices unilaterally. Violators would be punished severely. In 1459, the Saxons of Brasov made a fatal mistake. They threw their support behind Dan III, yet another rival claimant to the Wallachian throne. Dan was a member of the Danesti branch of the royal family, the same faction that had contested power with Vlad's ancestors for generations. The Saxons gave him money. They gave him shelter. They gave him a base from which to launch attacks on Wallachian territory. The merchants of Brasov calculated that a weak, dependent prince on the Wallachian throne would be better for business than Vlad and his trade restrictions. Vlad's response was devastating. He crossed into Transylvania with a raiding force and struck at the villages around Brasov. He burned farms. He seized livestock. He took captives, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, even students suspected of espionage, and marched them back to Wallachia. The chronicles of Brasov record that he impaled many of them in sight of the city walls, a message that required no translation. He reportedly burned parts of Brasov itself and the surrounding suburbs, though the extent of the damage is disputed among scholars. The Saxons had miscalculated. They had assumed that Vlad, dependent on Hungarian support, would not dare attack subjects of the Hungarian crown. They had not understood what kind of man he was. The punitive raids continued for years, not just once, but repeatedly, whenever the Saxons sheltered another rival or violated his trade laws. Villages around both Brasov and Sibiu learned to fear the Wallachian voivode. Trade disruption cost the Saxons enormous profits. And something else emerged from the conflict, something that would outlive Vlad by centuries. The Saxons had access to a new technology, the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg had invented movable type barely a decade earlier, and German cities were eager to exploit it. By the 1480s, German printers were producing pamphlets about Dracula, Vlad the Dragon's son. The first known printed pamphlet appeared in 1488, though manuscript versions circulated earlier. These pamphlets, illustrated with crude woodcuts, described Vlad's atrocities in lurid detail. They showed him dining among impaled bodies, laughing as victims screamed. They became bestsellers in German merchant cities, the world's first printed horror stories. And they were propaganda. The men who had tried to control Wallachian trade, who had sheltered Vlad's enemies, who had lost villages and profits to his raids, were now shaping his legacy for posterity. The vampire legend would not emerge for another 4 centuries, but the foundation was being laid, a monster created not just by Vlad's actions, but by the stories his enemies told about him. Impalement was not Vlad's invention. The practice of inserting a stake through a human body and raising it upright had been documented for at least 2,000 years before Vlad was born. The Assyrian Empire used it as a standard punishment for rebellion. Their stone reliefs, visible today in museums around the world, depict rows of impaled figures outside conquered cities, carved with the same meticulous detail they used for hunting scenes and court ceremonies. It was simply part of statecraft. The Persian Empire continued the tradition. When Darius I reconquered Babylon after a revolt in 522 BCE, the ancient historian Herodotus records that he impaled approximately 3,000 of the city's leading citizens. The mass execution served 2 purposes. It punished the rebellion, and it ensured there would not be another. A generation of Babylonian leadership was eliminated in a single afternoon. The Ottomans, who would become Vlad's enemies, used impalement extensively. They called it to place on the stake. Vlad almost certainly witnessed Ottoman impalements during his years as a hostage. He may have seen condemned prisoners prepared for the stake. He may have seen their bodies displayed afterward. He learned, as the Ottomans had learned, that this method of execution communicated something that a simple beheading could not. The stake was a message. A body on a stake could be positioned to face a particular direction, toward an approaching army, toward a rebellious city, toward the embassy of a foreign power. It remained visible for days, weeks, sometimes longer if the weather was cold enough. Unlike a head on a pike, the full body was displayed, impossible to ignore. The victim did not simply die. The victim was transformed into a sign. The psychology of the stake was calculated. Vlad understood, as the Assyrians and Persians and Ottomans had understood, that the method of execution mattered as much as the fact of execution. A beheading was quick. A hanging was public, but soon over. The stake was different. The stake was a display. Historical analysis suggests that stakes used for impalement were typically 3 to 4 inches wide, with blunted ends rather than sharp points. The blunting was deliberate. A sharp stake would kill quickly. The executioner might pierce a vital organ within minutes. A blunt stake, carefully positioned, could avoid immediate fatal damage. Survival time varied from 1 to 3 days, depending on positioning and weather conditions. The condemned remained conscious for much of this time. Vlad did not invent this methodology. He simply applied it with industrial efficiency. The chronicles record executions of dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of victims at once. The bodies were arranged in patterns, in ranks, by height, a grim hierarchy of the condemned. They were positioned on roads leading into Wallachia, on hillsides visible from miles away. The message was not subtle. This is what happens here. This is who rules here. Consider carefully before you approach. How many victims were there in total? The numbers are almost certainly exaggerated by hostile chroniclers. German pamphlets claimed 80,000 to 100,000. Ottoman sources spoke of similar figures. Modern historians have cross-referenced these accounts with other evidence and found significant inflation. One famous account claiming 600 impaled Saxon merchants was likely closer to 41. A realistic estimate for Vlad's total victims across his reign might be closer to 2,000 to 5,000. The propaganda served its purpose. Both Vlad's enemies and his admirers had reasons to inflate the numbers. Vlad would soon have the opportunity to test this weapon against the greatest army in the world. Once a year, Wallachia paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire. The payment was called the jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslim subjects of the Sultan. Wallachia owed approximately 10,000 gold ducats annually. That was the monetary cost. There was also a human cost. Young boys, taken from Wallachian families and sent to the Ottoman court to be trained as janissaries, elite soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. The system was called devshirme, and it worked like this. Ottoman officials would travel through Christian territories, selecting healthy boys between the ages of 8 and 18. The boys would be converted to Islam, educated and trained. The most promising became janissaries, the feared infantry corps that had helped conquer Constantinople. Others became administrators, translators, or court officials. They would never see their families again. The number Wallachia owed varies depending on the source. Some accounts say 500 boys per year, others say 1,000. Whatever the exact figure, the principle was the same. Wallachia bought its survival by paying gold and surrendering its children. Vlad understood this system intimately. He had been part of it himself. He and his brother Radu had been hostages, collateral ensuring their father's cooperation. He knew what happened to those boys. He knew what Radu had become. For 6 years after taking the throne in 1456, Vlad paid the tribute. He understood the calculus. The Ottoman Empire had conquered Constantinople in 1453. Mehmed II, the Sultan who had done it, the man Vlad had watched grow up in the Ottoman court, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Wallachia's entire military force was perhaps 30,000 men. Direct confrontation meant annihilation. Vlad paid the gold. He sent the boys. He bided his time. By 1461, the calculus had changed. Hungary under Matthias Corvinus was promising a new crusade. Pope Pius II was calling for Christian unity against the Ottomans. Venice, which had lost profitable trading posts to Ottoman expansion, was contributing funds. The Republic of Ragusa was providing intelligence. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that Wallachia might not have to face the empire alone. Vlad began to reconsider his options. The Hungarians were willing to back him. The Pope was blessing the enterprise. The Venetians were paying. That year, the tribute did not arrive in Constantinople. The Ottoman envoys arrived at Targovist expecting submission. They came to demand the overdue tribute, the gold and the boys that Wallachia owed. They came with the full authority of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of the Eastern Roman Empire, the man who had ended a civilization that had lasted 1,000 years. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who represented an empire that had never lost a major war. When they entered Vlad's throne room, they did not remove their turbans. This was, they explained, their religious custom. A Muslim removes his head covering only before God. No earthly ruler, certainly not a Christian vassal prince of a minor Balkan principality, warranted such respect. The story of what happened next appears in multiple sources, though historians debate whether it actually occurred or was later embellishment. According to the accounts, Vlad listened to the envoy's explanation. He nodded. He said that he wished to help them honor their custom. If they would never remove their turbans before any man, then he would ensure they never had to. He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their heads, driving iron nails through the cloth and into the skulls of the diplomats. The envoys died, of course. and Vlad sent them back to the Sultan as a message. Whether the nailed turban incident is historical fact or propaganda invention created decades later, the underlying reality is documented. Vlad rejected the Ottoman demands. He refused to pay the tribute. He refused to send the boys. And he did something more provocative still. He launched a winter campaign across the Danube into Ottoman Bulgaria, attacking villages and outposts, killing thousands, burning everything he could not carry away. He was not merely refusing to pay, he was attacking. Mehmed II sent another emissary, a Greek diplomat named Thomas Kataboulinos, sometimes called Yunus Bey, to summon Vlad to Constantinople. Vlad was to present himself before the Sultan and explain his defiance. The summons was an ultimatum wrapped in diplomatic language. Everyone understood what would happen if Vlad obeyed. He would be imprisoned or killed. His throne would be given to someone more compliant, probably his brother Radu, who remained at the Ottoman court and had become a favorite of the Sultan. Vlad knew what the Ottomans did to vassals who became inconvenient. His own father had been murdered after years of trying to appease both sides. Vlad did not go to Constantinople. He lured Mehmed's next delegation, a military force led by General Hamza Bey, into an ambush. The Ottoman soldiers were captured, and then Vlad did what he had become famous for. He impaled them, all of them. He left their bodies along the Danube for the Ottoman border patrols to find. The war had begun. In the winter of 1462, Vlad crossed the Danube. The river froze solid in the harsh cold, solid enough to support cavalry, solid enough to march an army across. This was not a normal occurrence. The Danube freezes perhaps once or twice a decade, and rarely long enough for military operations. Vlad had been watching the weather. He had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The frozen river transformed geography. What was normally an impassable barrier became a highway into Ottoman territory. Vlad had approximately 30,000 soldiers, a mix of cavalry, infantry, and irregular forces drawn from Wallachian villages. The Ottoman territory on the far bank had garrisons scattered along the river, but nothing that could stop a concentrated strike force moving at night. He had calculated that Mehmed II would not expect an attack in winter. Ottoman armies campaigned in warm months. They needed grass for their horses, forage for their supply trains. Winter warfare in the Balkans was madness. Vlad had calculated that the Ottomans would not be able to respond quickly. By the time word reached Constantinople, the raids would be over. He had calculated correctly. The raids began in January and continued through February. Vlad's forces swept along the Danube from Obluchitsa in the east, near where the river flows into the Black Sea, to Rahova in the west, a distance of nearly 400 miles of river frontier. They attacked villages, outposts, and trade settlements. They targeted Ottoman Turkish populations and Muslim Bulgarian converts. Christian Bulgarians, according to Vlad's own account, were generally spared and given a choice. Many were taken back across the Danube and resettled in Wallachia, a strategic decision to both depopulate Ottoman frontier territory and increase his own population base. These were people who would farm Wallachian land, pay Wallachian taxes, and owe their survival to the Wallachian voivode. The campaign was methodical. Villages were surrounded at night, every exit blocked. Anyone who resisted was killed immediately. Those who surrendered were evaluated, questioned about their religion, their loyalties, their knowledge of Ottoman troop movements. Muslims were executed or captured for later impalement as examples. Christians were given the choice to relocate to Wallachia or watch their homes burn. The Wallachian soldiers moved quickly, never staying in one place long enough for the scattered Ottoman garrisons to concentrate against them. When Ottoman cavalry did approach, Vlad's forces melted back across the frozen river, disappearing into the night. They were ghosts. They were everywhere, and they were burning the frontier. On February 11th, 1462, Vlad sat down to write a letter. It was addressed to Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, his nominal ally, the man who had promised crusade support, the man who controlled whether Wallachia would fight the Ottoman Empire alone or with the backing of Christian Europe. Vlad needed to document what he had accomplished. He needed to prove his value as an ally. He needed military reinforcement, and he needed it soon. The letter survives. It is preserved in Hungarian archives, one of the few primary sources we have in Vlad's own words, not filtered through hostile German pamphlets or Ottoman chroniclers, but his own report to his own ally. In it, he states, "We killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, not counting those who were burned in their homes or whose heads were cut off by our soldiers and not brought back for counting." The precision of the number is striking, not about 20,000, not many thousands, but 23,884. Vlad was keeping count. His soldiers were bringing back evidence of their kills, and someone was tallying them with the methodical precision of a tax collector. The letter lists the territories devastated, from Oblusita near the Black Sea coast to Rahova on the western Danube, including villages at Novoselo, Samovit, and Gigin. It was a campaign that covered hundreds of miles of Ottoman frontier, executed in the dead of winter by an army that should have been huddled around fires waiting for spring. Vlad describes capturing enemy commanders, including Hamza Pasha, a general he ambushed near the fortress of Giurgiu. According to some accounts, Vlad infiltrated Giurgiu disguised as an Ottoman soldier, speaking the Turkish he had learned as a child hostage, before signaling his men to attack. The fortress fell. Hamza Pasha was captured and later impaled. To verify his claims, Vlad reportedly sent physical proof to Matthias Corvinus, sacks filled with severed noses and ears from the dead. Each nose represented a body. Each ear could be matched to a head. The Hungarian court could count them. This was not boasting. It was documentation of the kind medieval rulers understood. Vlad was demonstrating that he had struck the Ottoman Empire harder than any Christian prince had managed since the fall of Constantinople 9 years earlier. He was asking for the promised support. He was proving that he had earned it. He was showing that Wallachia alone had done what the Crusades had failed to do, inflict massive casualties on the Ottomans and survive. The strategy went beyond killing. Vlad understood what was coming. Mehmed II would respond to the raids with overwhelming force. The Sultan had conquered Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, defended by legendary walls that had stood for 1,000 years. He would not tolerate a vassal prince murdering his subjects and burning his territory. He had destroyed the Byzantine Empire. He could certainly destroy Wallachia. Vlad understood the math. He had perhaps 30,000 soldiers at full strength. Mehmed could field 90,000 or more, 3 times Vlad's numbers, with better equipment, better training, and a supply system that had supported campaigns across 3 continents. Wallachia could not win a conventional battle against the Ottoman army. The numbers were simply impossible. Vlad had to fight a different kind of war, scorched earth. Everywhere his forces went, they destroyed the infrastructure that an invading army would need. Granaries were burned, not just emptied, but burned to ash so no one could use them. Livestock was slaughtered or driven back to Wallachia. Wells were poisoned with animal carcasses or collapsed entirely, their stone walls pushed in so that even digging new ones would take days. Villages were depopulated, the inhabitants killed, captured, or fled into the Carpathian Mountains. When Mehmed's army eventually came, it would find nothing. No food, no fodder for horses, no fresh water, no local population to press into service as guides or laborers. The Ottoman supply lines would stretch back across the Danube, hundreds of miles of vulnerable wagons moving slowly through hostile territory. This was defensive destruction. Vlad was trading his enemy's territory for his own survival. The Bulgarian Christians he resettled in Wallachia would farm his land and pay his taxes. The Bulgarian Muslims and Turks who died along the Danube would never threaten his borders again. The burned infrastructure would slow the Ottoman advance by weeks, perhaps longer. Every well that needed digging was a delay. Every grain silo that wasn't there was a supply wagon that had to come from further back. Every depopulated village was a night without shelter, without local knowledge, without laborers. He knew Mehmed was coming. He was preparing the battlefield before the battle began. The letter to Matthias was not just documentation, it was a plea. Vlad had done everything he could alone. Now he needed the crusade that had been promised. He needed Hungarian cavalry and Venetian gold and papal blessing. He needed the Christian alliance that had been discussed for years to finally act. The 23,884 bodies along the Danube were his credentials. They were his argument. They were his claim on Christian support. The support would not come in time. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed II assembled the largest army he had commanded since the siege of Constantinople 9 years earlier. The Ottoman chronicler Tursun Bey described it as huge, second in size only to the one this sultan had led against Constantinople. Contemporary sources estimated the force at anywhere from 90,000 to 150,000 soldiers. Modern historians generally accept a figure between 60,000 and 100,000, still an overwhelming force by any medieval standard. To put this in perspective, the entire population of Wallachia was perhaps 500,000 people. Mehmed was bringing an army the size of a major city. The army gathered at Adrianople, the Ottoman capital before Constantinople fell. It included the elite Janissary infantry, professional soldiers, many of them converted Christians taken as boys through the Devshirme system that Vlad knew so intimately from his own captivity. It included the Sipahi cavalry, heavily armored horsemen who held land grants in exchange for military service, trained from childhood to fight on horseback. It included the Akinci, light cavalry scouts and raiders who would screen the advance and terrorize the countryside ahead of the main force. It included engineers who had breached the walls of Constantinople, siege specialists with the latest gunpowder weapons, supply coordinators managing a logistics operation that spanned 3 continents, and an endless train of wagons carrying food, fodder, ammunition, and equipment for what promised to be a long campaign. Supporting the land army was a fleet of 25 galleons and 150 smaller vessels, sailing up the Danube to transport supplies and cut off any Wallachian retreat to the north or east. This was not a punitive raid. This was an invasion designed to end Wallachian independence permanently and incorporate the principality into the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed II led the army personally. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople at 21 years old, ending a civilization that had lasted since the days of Rome, was now 30 years old, at the height of his power and his ambition. He had never lost a major campaign. He had crushed Serbian resistance at Kosovo. He had absorbed the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. He had forced the Venetians and Genoese to pay tribute for what remained of their Black Sea trading posts. He was planning further campaigns against the Hungarians, the Venetians, even Rome itself. The idea that a vassal prince of a minor Balkan principality could defy him was an insult that required a personal response. Mehmed brought something else with him, a replacement. Radu, Vlad's younger brother, rode with the Ottoman army at the head of a contingent of Janissaries. Radu had remained at the Ottoman court after Vlad escaped. He had converted to Islam. He had become a favorite of the Sultan. Sources suggest they may have been lovers, close companions since their shared childhood at the Ottoman court. Radu was now a polished Ottoman courtier, handsome and diplomatic. everything his brother was not. The plan was simple: destroy Vlad, install Radu as the new voivode, and Wallachia would become an obedient vassal forever. Against this force, Vlad had perhaps 30,000 soldiers at full strength. Many had been killed or wounded in the winter campaign across the Danube. Many were peasant conscripts, farmers given spears and told to fight, with minimal training and equipment scavenged from previous battles. Some had never held a weapon before being drafted. His core force was smaller, perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 professional cavalry, hardened veterans who had survived the Turkish captivity, the boyar purges, and years of continuous warfare. He had some Hungarian mercenaries who had come south for pay and adventure. He had volunteers from Transylvania who hated the Ottomans for their own reasons. It was not enough. The math was simple and brutal. If Mehmed brought 100,000 soldiers, Vlad was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. If Mehmed brought only 60,000, the conservative modern estimate, Vlad was still outnumbered 2 to 1, and the quality differential was even worse. Ottoman janissaries were considered the finest infantry in the world. Ottoman cavalry had conquered from the Balkans to Mesopotamia. Ottoman siege engineers had breached the walls of Constantinople. Wallachian peasants with farm implements repurposed as weapons could not match them in open battle. Any pitched engagement would be a slaughter. Vlad knew this better than anyone. He had seen the Ottoman military machine from the inside during his years as a hostage. He had watched them train, watched them drill, watched them prepare for the campaign that took Constantinople. He knew their tactics, their discipline, their capabilities. He had no illusions about his chances in a conventional war. An army that could breach walls that had stood for 1,000 years could certainly overwhelm the wooden walls of Targovist. But Vlad was not planning a conventional war. Every well he had poisoned, every village he had burned, every person he had killed or resettled during the winter campaign was preparation for this moment. The Ottoman army would find nothing to eat. Their supply lines would stretch back across the Danube, hundreds of miles of vulnerable wagons, moving slowly through hostile, depopulated territory. The Wallachian forces would avoid pitched battle entirely, melting into the forests and mountains, striking at night, vanishing before dawn. Vlad could not defeat the Ottoman Empire. He had never imagined he could. But perhaps he could make conquering Wallachia cost more than it was worth, cost so much in men, in supplies, in reputation, that Mehmed would decide the principality was more trouble than it was worth. That was his only strategy. That was his only hope. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad assembled approximately 7,000 cavalry in the darkness outside Targovishte. The capital, the same city where his brother Mircea had been buried alive by the boyars, the same city from which he had launched his purges, was now behind him. Ahead lay the Ottoman camp. Mehmed II had brought his army across the Danube 4 weeks earlier, crossing at Vidin and advancing through the scorched wasteland Vlad had prepared for him. The Ottoman forces had found nothing to eat, nothing to drink, no one to enslave for labor. But they had kept coming, and now they were here, camped outside the Wallachian capital, with perhaps 90,000 soldiers spread across the valley. Vlad had studied this army. He had studied it for 20 years, first as a hostage in the Ottoman court, watching the janissaries drill, watching the commanders plan, learning the rhythms and routines of the military machine that might one day destroy him. He knew how the camp would be arranged. He knew where the Sultan's tent would be. He knew that the Ottoman army, despite its discipline, was not expecting an attack. Why would it be? Vlad had perhaps 30,000 men at the start of the campaign. Scattered engagements, ambushes, and the relentless harassment of the Ottoman supply lines had cost him thousands more. The Wallachians were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. No sane commander would attack a force 3 times his size. But Vlad was not planning to win a battle. He was planning to kill one man. If Mehmed II died, the invasion would collapse. The Ottoman succession was never smooth. The princes fought each other for the throne. The Janissaries backed their favorites. The empire turned inward to settle its own affairs. A dead sultan meant years of instability. It meant Wallachia would be forgotten while Constantinople sorted itself out. One thrust of a sword, one arrow in the darkness, and everything changed. The plan was assassination. The 7,000 cavalry would strike the Ottoman camp at midnight, the darkest hour, when sentries would be drowsy and campfires burned low. They would drive through the outer perimeter, create as much chaos as possible, and a strike team would fight its way to the Sultan's tent. Vlad himself would lead it. He knew the layout. He knew which tent was Mehmed's. He had, according to some accounts, personally scouted the camp in disguise, speaking the Turkish he had learned as a boy. He would kill the man he had watched grow up, and then he would vanish before dawn. They struck at midnight. The outer Ottoman sentries were killed in silence before they could raise the alarm, throats cut, bodies dragged into the darkness. The first the sleeping camp knew of the attack was the thunder of hooves and the crash of cavalry smashing through the tent lines. Panic spread faster than the horses. Ottoman soldiers stumbled from their bedrolls, reaching for weapons in the dark, unable to tell friend from enemy. The Wallachians wore no identifying marks, only dark armor and darker intent. In the chaos, the Ottomans killed each other. Men shouted in Turkish and were cut down by other men who did not recognize them. Units formed and charged at shadows. Fires spread as kicked campfires caught canvas, and the flames illuminated running men who became targets for Wallachian archers. The Venetian chronicler Domenico Balbi, writing from reports that reached Italy in the following weeks, estimated that 10,000 to 15,000 Ottomans died that night. Modern historians consider this number inflated, but even conservative estimates place the casualties in the thousands. Most were killed by their own panicked comrades in the confusion rather than by Wallachian swords. That was the genius of the attack. Vlad had turned the Ottoman army's size against it. A smaller force could coordinate. A smaller force knew its own men. A force of 90,000, spread across miles of camp, could not tell who was killing whom. Vlad and his strike team drove toward the Sultan's tent. They had studied its position. They knew the layout of the camp's center, where the command staff would be located. They fought their way through the chaos, 7,000 men creating a wall of death and fire around them as they pushed deeper. And then, they reached the tent they had targeted. They cut through the guards. They stormed inside. Sultan Mehmed II was not there. In the confusion of the initial attack, Mehmed's personal guard had moved him to another location. Some accounts say he was in his vizier's tent. Others say he had been warned by scouts who spotted the Wallachian approach. Whatever the reason, the assassins killed the men inside the wrong tent. High-ranking officers, perhaps. Commanders who might have been mistaken for the Sultan in the darkness. Valuable targets, but not the target. Mehmed lived. Before dawn, Vlad's forces withdrew. They did not stay to exploit the chaos. They did not try to hold territory or capture prisoners for ransom. As the first grey light appeared over the Carpathian foothills, the 7,000, now perhaps fewer, losses unknown, rode back toward the mountains. The Ottoman camp burned behind them. Thousands of bodies lay in the churned mud between smoldering tents, and the Sultan was still alive. The assassination had failed, but the attack itself had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. A force outnumbered 3 to 1 had struck the greatest army in the world and vanished before it could respond. The Ottomans had lost thousands of men, many to their own confusion, and gained nothing. Their supplies were strained. Their morale was shattered. Their sultan had nearly been killed in his own tent, and they had not seen the Wallachians coming. They had not seen them leave. The behavior is worth examining. Attack at midnight, vanish before sunrise, strike from darkness, disappear before the light of day reveals you. The Ottomans were superstitious. They believed in jinn and spirits. They believed that unholy things walked the night, and now a force had struck them that seemed less like an army and more like a curse. They could not catch it. They could not see it. They could only count the dead it left behind. This is the behavior that would become, centuries later, the template for the vampire. Not the drinking of blood that came from other sources, other legends merging over time, but the core pattern, the creature that emerges from darkness, kills without warning, and vanishes before dawn. Vlad was not a vampire, but he was behaving like one, like something inhuman, something that could not be fought by normal means. The legend was not invented from nothing. It was observed. It was documented. It was remembered. The Ottoman army did not pursue. For 2 days after the night attack, Mehmed's forces stayed in their burning camp, regrouping, counting dead, trying to understand what had happened. The Sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had breached walls that had stood for 1,000 years, had been made to look foolish by a vassal prince with a fraction of his numbers. When the army finally began to move again, it moved toward Targovist. Vlad had withdrawn to the mountains. The capital was abandoned, its population evacuated. Mehmed would find nothing there but empty streets and silence, and something else. Something waiting on the road ahead. 2 days after the night attack, the Ottoman army resumed its march toward Targovist. The Sultan was alive. The invasion was still underway. Mehmed II had come too far and lost too many men to turn back now. He had promised the Ottoman court that Wallachia would be brought to heel. He had promised to install his childhood companion Radu on the Wallachian throne. He had staked his reputation on this campaign. Retreat was not an option. The army that resumed its march was not the same force that had crossed the Danube a month earlier. The night attack had cost them thousands of soldiers, killed by Wallachians, killed by their own confused comrades, killed by fires that had spread through the tent city. The survivors were shaken. They had faced enemies before, but enemies who stood and fought, enemies who could be seen and measured and destroyed in open battle. The Wallachians were different. The Wallachians came in the darkness and vanished before dawn. They struck without warning and could not be caught. They seemed less like soldiers and more like spirits, jinn, perhaps, or something worse. The Ottoman soldiers were superstitious. They whispered to each other about what they had seen. The road to Targovist wound through the Wallachian countryside, depopulated now, the villages empty, the wells poisoned or collapsed, the granaries burned to ash. Vlad's scorched earth campaign had done its work. Every mile they marched was a mile without food, without clean water, without local laborers to press into service. The Ottoman supply lines stretched back across the Danube, hundreds of miles of wagons moving slowly through hostile territory, vulnerable to ambush at any crossing point. The soldiers were hungry. The horses were thin. The water they found was often undrinkable, fouled with animal carcasses, or worse. Disease was spreading through the ranks, dysentery, fever, the afflictions that came from bad water and worse food. But they kept marching. Constantinople had not stopped Mehmed. A vassal prince of a minor principality would not stop him either. The road curved around a low rise. The vanguard scouts crested the hill and saw what lay beyond. They stopped. They did not move forward. The column behind them slowed to a halt as word spread backward, man to man, rank to rank, until the entire 90,000-man army had stopped moving. No one gave an order to halt. No trumpet sounded. The column simply stopped because the men at the front had stopped, and no one behind them could see why. Slowly, in groups, the Ottoman soldiers climbed the rise to see what had frozen their scouts in place. And then they saw. Before them stretched a forest of the dead. The Greek historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, writing within a generation of the events, described its dimensions: 17 stades long and 7 stades wide, approximately 2 miles by 3/4 of a mile, covering an area of 7 acres or more. The numbers are staggering. Thousands of wooden stakes rose from the earth like trees, and on each stake hung a body. Men, women, children, according to some accounts. Ottoman soldiers, Bulgarian converts, Wallachian traitors, anyone Vlad considered an enemy of his realm. The bodies were arranged in patterns, in rows, by height, shorter stakes in front and taller behind, so that the entire display could be seen from a distance. It was organized horror. It was art of a terrible kind. At the center, on the tallest stake of all, hung Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman general Vlad had ambushed months before, the man who had been sent to summon the Wallachian prince to Constantinople. The message was clear. The number is disputed. Vlad's own letter to Matthias Corvinus claimed approximately 23,000 Turks and Bulgarians killed during the winter campaign. Some historians have suggested the Forest of the Impaled contained 20,000 bodies, the full toll of the campaign, assembled in one place for maximum impact. Others argue the number was closer to 1,600 or 1,700, still an immense display, still an acre of corpses on stakes, still something no European had seen since the days of the Roman Empire when crucifixion lined the roads. Whatever the exact figure, the effect was the same. The Ottoman army had come to conquer Wallachia, and Wallachia had prepared a welcome. The smell reached the soldiers before they crested the rise. The bodies had been there for days, perhaps weeks. Some were prisoners from the night attack, others from earlier engagements, still others from the winter Danube campaign, preserved on their stakes through the spring and into the summer heat. Decomposition had set in. The stench of death hung over the field like a physical presence, a wall of decay that had to be pushed through. The chroniclers recorded that some Ottoman soldiers vomited, others wept, some fell to their knees and prayed, some simply turned and walked back toward the Danube, deserting the army that had brought them to this nightmare, preferring punishment for desertion to one more step toward Targovishte. The discipline that had conquered Constantinople, the finest military discipline in the world, was breaking down. These were not soldiers facing battle. These were men facing something they could not understand. Sultan Mehmed II rode forward to see for himself, the man who had conquered Constantinople at 21, the man who had ended a civilization that had lasted since the days of Rome, the man who commanded the greatest army in the world and had never lost a major campaign. He rode past his frozen soldiers, past his generals who waited for orders, past the vanguard scouts who had not moved since they crested the rise. He looked at the forest of stakes stretching to the walls of the abandoned capital. He looked at the body of Hamza Pasha, whom he had sent to negotiate with Vlad months before. He looked at the organized horror, the geometric patterns, the deliberate arrangement by height, the message written in corpses across acres of Wallachian soil. Chalkokondyles recorded what happened next. Mehmed was seized with amazement, the chronicler wrote, and declared that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. Some translations render his words differently. A man who does such things is worth much. Whatever the exact phrasing, the meaning was clear. The Sultan who had breached the walls of Constantinople could not breach this. The cost would be too high. The army was starving, demoralized, terrified of an enemy they could not see, and could not fight by conventional means. And even if they won, even if they destroyed Vlad and installed Radu on the throne, what would they have conquered? Empty villages, poisoned wells, a population that would rise up the moment the Ottoman army withdrew, a land ruled by ghosts. Mehmed turned back. The greatest army in the world retreated from Wallachia without capturing the capital. Targovishte stood empty. Vlad had withdrawn to the mountains with what remained of his forces, abandoning the city to whatever conqueror cared to take it. But the Ottoman army did not pursue. They had seen enough. They marched back toward the Danube, back toward Bulgaria, back toward Constantinople. Some accounts say Mehmed left Radu behind with a smaller force to continue the campaign through political means, to win over the boyars who had always resented Vlad, to offer amnesty and stability instead of terror. The main invasion of Wallachia was over. This is the second vampire forensic marker. The first was the behavior: attack at midnight, vanish before dawn. This is the image: bodies that refuse to lie down. The dead, suspended between earth and sky, neither buried nor burned, neither at rest nor alive. In folklore across Eastern Europe, this was the defining characteristic of the vampire: the corpse that would not stay in its grave, the dead that walked, the body that defied the natural order of death and decay. Vlad had created a landscape of that nightmare. He had built, outside his capital, the visual vocabulary of the vampire myth centuries before Bram Stoker would put it into words. The stakes, the impaled, the dead that do not rest. The stake stopped an empire. The man who had done such things, who possessed such a diabolical understanding, would be remembered. He would become a legend. He would become Dracula. While Mehmed withdrew, he left behind something more dangerous than an army: Vlad's brother. Radu III Chel Frumos, Radu the Handsome, had ridden with the Ottoman invasion. He had been there when the main army turned back at the Forest of the Impaled. But Radu did not leave with them. He stayed behind with a smaller force, perhaps a few thousand Ottoman cavalry and Janissary infantry, along with a mission more subtle than conquest. Mehmed understood what brute force could not achieve: the scorched earth, the guerrilla tactics, the terror that had made even the Sultan himself retreat. These could not be defeated by conventional warfare. The Wallachians would simply melt into the mountains and wait for the invaders to starve. But they could be defeated by politics. They could be defeated by offering an alternative. Radu was everything Vlad was not. Where Vlad was dark and grim, radiating menace, even in diplomatic contexts, Radu was handsome enough that chroniclers across multiple cultures commented on his beauty. Where Vlad had spent his Ottoman captivity seething with hatred, watching and learning and waiting for vengeance, Radu had adapted. He had learned to charm. He had learned to negotiate. He had learned the arts of the Ottoman court, poetry, conversation, the subtle politics of favor and alliance. He had formed a bond with the young Prince Mehmed that had lasted into adulthood. Some sources suggest they were lovers, others say merely close companions, but all agree they were intimately connected. When Mehmed needed someone to rule Wallachia, Radu was the obvious choice. He had converted to Islam willingly. He spoke Turkish as his first language now. He had become, in every way that mattered, Ottoman. But he was also, by blood, a Draculeshti prince. He had as much legal claim to the Wallachian throne as Vlad did, perhaps more, since Vlad had technically been deposed and was now a fugitive. And Radu came not with threats of impalement, but with promises of peace. No more endless war with the Ottomans. No more crushing tribute, or at least tribute that would be paid reliably instead of provoking invasions that devastated the countryside. No more terror. No more stakes lining the roads. No more Easter feasts that ended in mass imprisonment. The boyar nobles of Wallachia, the same class Vlad had spent years purging and terrifying and forcing to build his mountain fortress at Poenari with their own noble hands, began to listen. Radu was offering them something Vlad never had: security. The boyars defected. One by one, then in groups, the noble families of Wallachia abandoned Vlad. These were not the boyars he had killed at his Easter feast years before. Those men were dead, their families broken, their estates confiscated. These were the survivors, the replacements, the new men he had elevated to fill the empty seats on his council. They had served him out of fear. They had watched colleagues impaled for minor offenses. They had built his castle with their own hands. Now someone was offering them an alternative, and the fear was not enough. Radu's army swelled with Wallachian defectors. Former soldiers who had marched with Vlad against the Ottomans now rode with his brother. Former administrators who had counted Vlad's tribute gold now counted Radu's bribes. Commanders who had led night raids against Ottoman camps now guided Radu's forces through the mountain passes they knew so well. The momentum had shifted. Terror works until it doesn't. Vlad retreated to Poenari Castle, the mountain fortress the old boyars had built with their own hands before dying on its stones. The castle was nearly impregnable, perched on a cliff above the Argis River, accessible only by 1,400 stone steps carved into the mountainside. A handful of men could defend it against an army, but impregnable fortresses require supplies, and supplies require loyalty, and loyalty was bleeding away by the day. Vlad's wife, a woman whose name the chronicles do not record, a noblewoman who had presumably married him during his years of power, was with him at Poenari. According to legend, when Radu's forces finally reached the castle and it became clear that no relief was coming, she climbed to the highest tower and threw herself into the river far below rather than be captured. The Argesh is still called, in local tradition, the Princess's River. Whether the story is true or embellishment, it captures the desperation of those final days. Vlad escaped. The chronicles disagree on exactly how. Some say through a secret passage known only to the builders. Some say he fought his way out with his last loyal guards in a midnight sally. What is certain is that by late 1462, he had fled north, across the Carpathian Mountains, into Transylvania. He was heading for Hungary. He expected King Matthias Corvinus, his ally, the man who had promised crusade support, the son of John Hunyadi, who had helped put Vlad on the throne 6 years before, to give him money, give him soldiers, and send him back to reclaim his kingdom. He expected gratitude for the war he had fought alone, while Christian Europe did nothing. He expected help. He was wrong. Matthias did not give Vlad an army. He gave him a prison cell. The king of Hungary, Hunyadi's son, the man whose father had helped put Vlad on the throne, and whose father's murder of Vlad Dracula had started the chain of vengeance that led to everything, had made different calculations. Matthias had received papal money for a crusade against the Ottomans. He had received Venetian gold. He had received the desperate pleas of Vlad himself, begging for the support that had been promised. Matthias had taken all of it, and he had done nothing. The crusade never came. While Vlad fought alone against Mehmed's 90,000 soldiers, while he burned his own country to deny the Ottomans supplies, while he launched night attacks against impossible odds and built forests of the impaled to terrify the Sultan into retreat, Matthias Corvinus stayed in Hungary. He spent the crusade funds on other things, court expenses, political projects, his own ambitions. When Vlad arrived in Transylvania, expecting salvation, he found instead that Matthias needed a scapegoat. The justification was a set of letters. Matthias produced documents allegedly written by Vlad to the Ottoman court, offering to switch sides, offering to become a Turkish vassal again if Mehmed would support him against Hungary. The letters were almost certainly forged. Modern historians have analyzed the language, the diplomatic formulas, the circumstances under which they appeared, and concluded that Matthias, or someone in his administration, fabricated them entirely. Vlad's entire war against the Ottomans made no sense if he had been secretly negotiating with them all along. But the letters gave Matthias what he needed: an excuse to imprison a man he had failed, a way to explain to the Pope and Venice why their crusade money had produced nothing, and a permanent hostage whose existence gave him leverage over both Wallachia and the Ottomans. Vlad was taken to Visegrad Castle, a fortress overlooking the Danube bend north of Buda. He would not leave Hungarian custody for 12 years. The years passed, 12 of them. At first, Vlad was a prisoner in the traditional sense, confined, guarded, isolated. But Matthias was not a fool. He understood that Vlad was too valuable to simply rot in a cell and too dangerous to simply execute. Over time, the imprisonment softened. Vlad was given quarters rather than a cell. He was allowed to attend court functions. He was given opportunities to demonstrate his continued value, his knowledge of Ottoman tactics, his understanding of Balkan politics, his ability to advise on matters concerning the principalities that bordered both Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. To survive, Vlad adapted. He converted from Orthodox Christianity to Roman Catholicism, the faith of the Hungarian court. Whether this was genuine religious conviction or pure political calculation, the chronicles do not say. Given everything else we know about Vlad, calculation seems more likely. He married a Hungarian noblewoman named Justina Szilágyi, a relative of Matthias Corvinus himself. She bore him sons. He became, in the eyes of the Hungarian court, domesticated. The Impaler, who had terrified the Ottoman Empire, was now attending Mass, wearing Hungarian clothes, dancing at court functions. Radu ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman puppet. The kingdom Vlad had fought to protect was paying tribute again, sending boys to the Janissary Corps again, serving as a buffer state for the Ottoman Empire exactly as it had before Vlad's defiance. Everything he had done, the impaling, the night attacks, the forests of the dead, seemed to have been for nothing. His brother sat on his throne, his country served his enemies, and he waited. He waited in comfort, but in captivity. He waited for 12 years. And then, in 1474, everything changed again. In 1476, after 12 years of captivity, Vlad III returned to Wallachia. The circumstances that freed him were complex. His brother Radu had died the year before. Some sources say of syphilis, others of wounds sustained in yet another skirmish with the Ottomans he was supposed to be serving. The puppet had outlived his usefulness. Wallachia had become unstable again, changing hands between rival claimants, none of them strong enough to hold the throne. The Ottomans were distracted by other campaigns, and Matthias Corvinus, the man who had imprisoned Vlad for a decade with fabricated evidence, had decided his captive might be useful after all. The coalition that returned Vlad to power was unlikely. Hungarian forces loyal to Matthias, the king who had betrayed him, provided the military backbone. Moldavian cavalry under Stephen the Great, Vlad's cousin, the man he had sheltered with during his first exile 30 years before, provided crucial support. Stephen had become one of the most successful rulers in Eastern Europe, defeating Ottoman armies repeatedly, and his endorsement legitimized Vlad's return. The same international crusade that had failed to materialize in 1462 was finally, partially, coming together, not to destroy the Ottoman Empire, but at least to install a reliable ally on the Wallachian throne. Vlad crossed the Carpathians in late 1476. He was in his mid-40s now, old by medieval standards, grey-bearded and weathered by years of comfortable captivity. He had converted to Catholicism. He had married a Hungarian noblewoman. He had sons being raised in Hungarian courts. He was not the same man who had built forests of the impaled 14 years before, but he was still Vlad Dracula, and he was coming home. The campaign was swift. The current Wallachian ruler, another member of the rival Danesti faction, fled rather than face the combined Hungarian-Moldavian force. Vlad entered Targovist, the capital he had abandoned when Radu's forces besieged Poenari, and reclaimed his father's throne for the third time. He had been voivode 3 times now, briefly in 1448, for 6 bloody years from 1456 to 1462, and now again in 1476. Each reign had been shorter than the last. This one would be the shortest of all. He would hold the throne for approximately 2 months. In December 1476, or perhaps January 1477, Vlad III died. The exact date is unknown. The exact circumstances are disputed. What the chronicles agree on is this: he was killed in a skirmish somewhere near Bucharest, in the marshy lowlands of southern Wallachia, less than 2 months after reclaiming his throne for the 3rd time. It was not a great battle. It was not a climactic confrontation with the Ottoman army that would be remembered by historians and celebrated in ballads. It was a small engagement, the kind of minor violence that fills the spaces between the events history remembers. Perhaps 50 men on each side, perhaps fewer. The sources disagree on who killed him. Some say Ottoman raiders. Mehmed had not given up on Wallachia, and Turkish forces still operated in the region, supporting yet another rival claimant from the Danesti family. Others say his own men, the boyar nobles who had betrayed his father, who had betrayed him to Radu, who had no reason to believe this 3rd reign would be any different from the terror-filled first 2. Vlad had always ruled by impalement and fear. Terror creates obedience, but it does not create loyalty. Perhaps, in that confused skirmish in the winter marshes, someone decided the impaler had impaled enough. Perhaps a Wallachian sword ended what Ottoman armies could not. One account suggests he was killed while separated from his bodyguard, struck down while pursuing or retreating, the chaos of small unit combat making it impossible to reconstruct what happened. Another claims he was wearing Ottoman-style armor for disguise, and his own men killed him by accident, not recognizing their voivode until it was too late. The location is usually given as somewhere near Snagov, a monastery on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. Whether Vlad died there or died elsewhere and was brought there for burial is unclear. What is clear is that his reign ended as suddenly as it had begun. The Hungarian-Moldavian coalition that had put him on the throne could not protect him from the enemies he had spent his entire life creating. The impaler died in the mud, in the cold, in a fight too small for the chroniclers to describe in detail. His killers cut off his head. This was standard practice for high-value enemies in the medieval world, proof of death that could be verified across hundreds of miles, a trophy that could be displayed to demonstrate power, a symbol that could be sent to those who needed to know that the threat was finally, permanently ended. Vlad's head was preserved in honey, a common method of preventing decay during transport across long distances. Honey's natural antibacterial properties kept flesh from rotting for weeks or months, and then the preserved head was sent to Constantinople. Mehmed II received the trophy, the Sultan who had retreated from the forest of the impaled 14 years earlier, who had looked upon 20,000 bodies on stakes and declared that he could not conquer a man with such a diabolical understanding. That Sultan now had proof that the man was dead. The irony was not lost on the Ottoman court. The head was displayed in Constantinople, mounted on a stake in a bitter echo of Vlad's own methods. The same technique he had used to terrorize thousands was used to display his remains. The Ottomans wanted everyone to see. The impaler had been impaled. The crowds of Constantinople came to look. This was the monster their soldiers had whispered about, the Christian prince who had attacked at midnight and vanished before dawn, who had built landscapes of nightmare to break the Ottoman will. Now he was just a head on a stake, no different from any other executed criminal. Whether Mehmed felt satisfaction or something else, respect, perhaps, for an enemy who had cost him so much, or simply relief that a persistent problem was finally solved, the chronicles do not record. What they do record is that Vlad's head remained on display in the Ottoman capital, a warning and a trophy, while his body was supposedly carried back to Wallachia for burial. The dragon's son was dead. But where was his body? Snagov Monastery sits on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. The monastery was already old when Vlad was born, founded perhaps in the 14th century, rebuilt and expanded by Wallachian rulers who used it as a fortress as much as a place of worship. The island location made it defensible. The sacred ground made it suitable for royal burials. According to tradition, after Vlad's death in that muddy skirmish in late 1476 or early 1477, his followers recovered his headless body and brought it here, to be buried before the altar in the place of honor reserved for princes of the blood. The monastery became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though not immediately and not openly. Vlad's reputation in the West was that of a monster. The German pamphlets had seen to that. But in Wallachia and Romania, memory was more complicated. He had been brutal, yes. He had impaled thousands. But he had also defied the Ottoman Empire when no one else would. He had fought for independence, however blood-soaked that fight had been. He was not simply a villain. He was a complicated figure whose legacy depended on who was telling the story. For centuries, the monks of Snagov maintained what they said was Vlad's grave. Visitors could see the stone slab before the altar, unmarked but known to those who cared to ask. The body of the impaler lay beneath, they said, headless but at rest. Buried in consecrated ground despite his crimes, perhaps because his conversion to Catholicism had been recognized, or perhaps because his defense of Christian lands against the Ottomans had earned him forgiveness. The tomb became part of the monastery's identity, the resting place of Dracula. In 1933, archaeologists opened the tomb. The excavation was led by Dinu Rosetti, a Romanian archaeologist investigating the monastery's history. They removed the stone slab before the altar, the traditional grave of Vlad III Dracula. They found nothing. No bones, no fragments of a coffin, no trace of a burial. The tomb that had been venerated for centuries as the resting place of the impaler was empty. A second excavation examined another grave, this one beneath the entrance threshold of the church. A less honorable position, but one sometimes used for burials. This tomb contained animal bones and fragments of silk that might have been a shroud. Some claimed this was the real grave, disturbed by centuries of flooding from the lake. Others pointed out that no human remains had been definitively identified. The skull was certainly missing, but that was expected, since it had been sent to Constantinople. What was unexpected was the absence of everything else. Theories proliferated. The tomb before the altar was a decoy, created to draw attention away from the real burial site. The body had been moved during one of the many conflicts that swept over the monastery in subsequent centuries, hidden by monks, stolen by enemies, reburied in an unknown location. The swampy conditions of the island had destroyed the remains through centuries of seasonal flooding. Or, and this was the theory that captured the imagination, the burial story had been fabricated from the beginning. Vlad's body had never been brought to Snagov at all. The tomb was empty because it had always been empty. The mystery suited the legend. The man who would not stay dead, even in literal archaeology. The prince whose enemies had displayed his head on a stake, whose followers had supposedly buried his body in sacred ground, and whose grave contained nothing at all. Like King Arthur sleeping beneath his hill, like Frederick Barbarossa waiting in his mountain cavern. Vlad had joined the company of legends who refused to stay buried. The vampire's tomb was empty. The vampire, perhaps, had never truly died. There are two Vlads. In Romania, Vlad III is remembered as a national hero. He defended his country against the Ottoman Empire when no one else would fight. He punished corrupt officials and treacherous nobles. He imposed order on a land that had known only chaos. Romanian folklore depicts him as a harsh but just ruler, a prince who impaled thieves and liars because that was what the times required. When Romanian nationalists sought symbols of resistance in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found Vlad waiting. The voivode, who had defied the Sultan, became an icon of independence. In Western Europe, particularly in Germany, the story was very different. The Saxon merchants of Transylvania had clashed with Vlad during his reign. Trade disputes, territorial conflicts, the normal friction between a Wallachian prince and the German colonies on his borders. When Vlad raided Saxon villages in 1459, the merchants responded with propaganda. The printing press had recently arrived in Europe, and the Saxons used it. Pamphlets spread through German-speaking lands depicting Vlad as a monster, eating dinner among the impaled, washing his hands in blood, killing for entertainment rather than statecraft. These pamphlets were among the first bestsellers of the print era. The German version of Vlad became the dominant Western narrative. The pamphlets were reprinted, translated, expanded. Each generation added new atrocities. The man who had killed thousands became the monster who had killed hundreds of thousands. The ruler who had used impalement as punishment became the sadist who impaled for pleasure. By the time Bram Stoker encountered these accounts 4 centuries later, Vlad had been transformed from a historical figure into a creature of pure nightmare. The propaganda had won. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Vlad III was brutal by any standard. He killed far more people than his political needs required. He used cruelty as theater. He was, by modern standards, a tyrant and a war criminal. He was also a defender of his people against overwhelming odds. He was a man forged by trauma, hostage, orphan, exile, who built a reign of terror because terror was the only tool he trusted. He was not simply a hero. He was not simply a monster. He was both. He was human. In 1897, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker published a novel called Dracula. Stoker had never visited Romania. He had never seen the Carpathian Mountains or the ruins of Poenari Castle. He had done his research through books, travel accounts, histories, folklore collections. Somewhere in that research, he found the name Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil, the name of a 15th century Wallachian prince who had terrorized the Ottoman Empire and terrified Western Europe. Stoker borrowed the name and gave it to his vampire count. The connection between the historical Vlad and the fictional Dracula is thinner than most people assume. Stoker's count is not Vlad III reimagined as a vampire. The count is Transylvanian, not Wallachian. His backstory mentions fighting the Turks, but provides few historical details. The novel's Dracula is a creature of Victorian Gothic imagination, an aristocratic predator who feeds on the living, spreads corruption through blood, and cannot be killed by ordinary means. The historical Vlad was simply a source for atmosphere and a name. And yet, the connection persists. The behaviors that made Vlad legendary map onto the vampire myth with uncanny precision. The man who attacked at midnight and vanished before dawn. The ruler who refused to let his enemies rest in peace, displaying their bodies on stakes for all to see. The prince whose tomb was empty when archaeologists opened it. The tyrant whose head was cut off after death and displayed in a foreign city. Every element of his story echoes the vampire legends that would eventually bear his name. The man who attacked from darkness, the bodies that would not lie down, the empty grave, the head on a stake, the legend that refuses to die. Vlad III. Dracula ruled Wallachia for 6 bloody years in the 15th century. Dracula has ruled the imagination ever since. The voivode died. The vampire lives forever.